It's my great pleasure to introduce Deborah to you tonight. You might not know this, but we have something in common. No, I don't ride horses. I actually don't make art. But I moved here from Cody, Wyoming. Some of you might know that. And Deborah and I share a great love for the American West, the landscape, the inspiration that that place certainly gives. And I know Deborah will tell us more about that tonight. So Ozarks are beautiful. It can't compete with the American West. I'm sorry, everyone. But stay here and just go visit Montana and Wyoming from time to time. So Deborah Butterfield, her sculptural forms are based on her unique subjects of horses. Captivated by horses all her life, she combined her interest in art and material with her fascination with the equine subjects and species while studying art at the University of California, Davis, where she received her MFA. With extraordinary focus and conviction, Butterfield works independently of the tides and trends of modernism and art movements and all of the other trendy things out there. She's become a master of three-dimensional images of horses, building her sculptures with no sketches or maquettes, working directly with wood pieces or found metal scraps. Despite the typical nature of the animal poses that Butterfield shapes, the postures of the sculptures have been described to evoke human emotions and demeanor. From the mid-70s through the mid-80s, she taught sculpture at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and at Montana State University in Bozeman. Since 1976, she has exhibited extensively with solo shows at the Seattle Art Museum, Dallas Museum of Fine Arts, Israeli Museum, Jerusalem, San Diego Museum of Art in California, the Yellowstone Art Museum in Billings, the Contemporary Art Museum in Honolulu, among many, many others. Her work is included in numerous public collections, including the Art Institute of Chicago, Metropolitan Museum of Art, Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City, San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, and of course, here at Crystal Bridges, and again, among many, many others. We are so honored to have Deborah here this evening. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you. I sprained my ankle coming here yesterday in the Denver airport, so I get to sit in this chair. So I'm very, very spoiled. Anyway, thank you for coming. Thank you for having me and for all the work. I can't believe when I've been treated more wonderfully by a museum or a group of people. Anyway, so I'm here to talk really about sculpture, but I chose to use the horse throughout my life as a metaphorical substitute for myself. And I was born in the day of the Kentucky Derby when Ponder won. So I think that's part of it, and Ponder was sired by Pensive, so it kind of all adds up. So that's, I hired, in the days of 4x5s and slides, I hired a photographer. I needed a picture, and I just hate pictures of just myself. So I went out in the pasture and stood next to Willie. And we didn't know until he developed the film that he was sticking his tongue out. He was so excited. I went to San Diego State for a couple semesters and I did a lot of ceramics and literature, and then I went to UC San Diego in 1969 and had Angela Davis, Herbert Marcuse, Linus Pauling lecturing and took wonderful classes there, and then I transferred to Davis. And I was a ceramic major. I wanted to study with Bob Arneson, and I actually got my undergraduate degree without hardly taking a regular art class. and then decided I wanted to go to grad school there. So I ended up getting in, and my teachers were Roy DeForest, Manuel Neri, William Wiley, and Wayne Thiebaud, as well as Bob Arneson, and they became very close friends, and I just can't believe how incredibly lucky I was to be in that environment. It was, at that time, grad programs were not that competitive. It was like art was this big table, and there was always a seat for everyone, because you were going to eat a different thing. There was room. Anyway, so this is one of my favorite pots that I made. Bob Arneson said we couldn't do pottery in class because it was a sculpture class and pottery wasn't for the university. So at night I made these pots, and of course during our critiques, Bob really loved pots. He just liked good pots, so that's all he talked about. And then in my senior year, I found myself actually getting bored with pots, and I had thought it was a spiritual thing that I was going to do, and I still think I will end up doing that when I'm too old to do this other stuff. And I ended up living on a horse farm and making a racehorse farm and making my rent by feeding the horses in the morning at Davis. So anyway, I had been raised as a little girl loving horses, drawing horses, everything, and had been teased quite brutally for it and tried to swear off when I was in high school. And then I found myself on this farm with all these thoroughbreds and baby horses. So eventually, of course, they let me start riding them, and I was just intrigued by the tack room and how these objects reminded me of pots from China and Southeast Asia. And I wanted to do art about myself and about the horse, but without having to do a human figure, and I didn't have the guts to do the horse yet. So by doing the saddle, I was implying the presence of the horse and the rider by the negative space it created for each. And one of the things, growing up riding Western in Southern California, there was such a Mexican influence on design. And then to study Chinese pottery, this reminded me so much of the carved porcelain, the incised peony patterns. And so later, I used that. And in this tack room, I was just captivated by the idea of an object that's useful, that we use every day, but then what happens when it's sleeping or not being used. So I loved the kind of, and later on it shows up in my reclining horses. I just loved how it was this object when nobody was paying attention to it, but it also, everybody gave me grief for making these saddles because they said they were so sexual. And so I draped the blanket over the phallic saddle horn to kind of, to tease, and like Greek statuary to kind of semi-reveal the figure by concealing it. And this shows a Ming Dynasty pot with slip trailing and then glaze pooled within it. And I realized I could never be a Chinese potter, and I wouldn't let myself make fake Chinese pots. But I had the format of this saddle, and so I allowed myself to make a Ming Dynasty saddle. And these are all life-size, and I had to make a fake horseback out of clay, fired clay and bricks, and then they're in 3 pieces. The stirrup and the leg breechings are separate and added on later. And what I found was that they had to be displayed. So for this one, I had to make a Ming Dynasty kind of sawhorse because a regular thing wouldn't do. And I hate table saws, and I don't like working with wood, and it just really turned me off. I really wanted a way of working that would allow a piece to just present itself on its own. And here shows an incised peony pattern of a northern Sung pot, which is white clay with black slip, and then the white pattern is incised, taken away. And this was my Sung Dynasty saddle. And I bisted it, and then when I put the glaze on it, it all cracked. And I was just brokenhearted. And then I remembered that often when the pots cracked, they would fill the cracks with gold. And it was a metaphor, if you will, for how when we get old, we have cracks and things, but we also have wisdom. And so within the damaged part is also wealth. And this kind of sums it all up. My first horse was one of the thoroughbred mares from this farm, and she tried to buck me off in a cactus patch. So I made this saddle in her honor, and it has it has porcelain spines, which I put in afterwards with silicone, so they kind of prickle when you touch them. But like anything that fragile, they'll just break. And it was again, a story about myself, or just being a young woman and how you had to be so fierce, and yet you were also at the same time so brittle and fragile. And then Bob Arneson said to me, "Did you ever see Lucas Samiris's work? He made these chairs with pins on them and stuff." And I said, so that's how I found out about him. And later I invited him to be a guest speaker at Madison. And I just showed him my work before we went around to see grad students. And I said, "Lucas, this ended up being an homage to you because it's how I discovered your work and why you're here." And he got a really funny look. I mean, he's a funny guy anyway. But he said, "My name means saddle maker in Greek." So, and the Chinese, the Sung saddle, oh dear, I'm doing bad things now. The Sung saddle was collected by a collector of Asian ceramics, so it also found a wonderful spot in the world. And then I went to Skowhegan School of Sculpture and Painting in Maine for a summer, and I knew they didn't have kilns, and I'd frankly gotten exhausted making kiln gods and appeasing them, and having to go through all these processes with my work so that you didn't know what you had until you were lucky enough to get it in one piece out of the kiln. But I didn't really know how to make art. I mean, I was a very verbal person, loved literature, loved puns, and in San Diego was very much rebuked for punning. So I get to Davis, and William Wiley is there, and every other sentence is a pun, and his drawings would be a tiny little watercolor up on top and then 2 paragraphs underneath for the title. And taking a drawing class from him, he would say, if you don't know what to make, think up a title and then illustrate it. And so I did like Let Sleeping Dogs Lie and Let Sleeping Logs Die. And this was a bed of leaves, and I'd started out with a watercolor, but my husband, John Buck, we weren't married at the time, had been to Skowhegan the year before and said, we didn't know hardwood forests in California, and he said there are all these incredible hardwood trees, and the leaves fall off, and in the winter they mulch down, but they become like fabric. And so I made this. I lashed the bed frame out of twigs and learned how to bind them together, and then I made a quilt out of these leaves and put it on there. And the faculty thought they wouldn't critique it because it was stick art, and it wasn't, they didn't think there was any central theme to it. And I was like, we're born on beds, we die on beds, we make love on beds, we cry on beds, we jump up and down, we hide under them. They're a very big part of our lives. And so by putting it out in the woods, I felt that it invited the viewer to finish the piece with their own ideas. And I loved Jackie Windsor's work, so this was 1972. And then I made my next piece, which they did critique and won the sculpture scholarship, but it was welded steel, and therefore correct. So it was welded steel with chicken wire and then burlap dipped in plaster. And our studios at Skowhegan were just little sheds out in the woods, and next to us was a herd of young dairy cows, young heifers. And being a Taurus, I thought I really wanted to make personal art, and so I decided to use the young cow as myself. And so this piece was about the unease of being young and in love and an artist and with this John Buck person and the insecurity of it all. And so she's standing like she's in the back of a pickup going around curves and trying to maintain her balance. And then I ended up taking a quarter off and going to England with John, where he had a fellowship. And California girl in England, I cried a lot. And, it was just sort of a sad place for me and very, very chauvinist and classist. I was just so naive about that. But I had been an exchange student of Finland, and in my freshman year of college went to an art film on a date, and it was a Finnish anima myth film in which this Lappi herder is out in the midnight sun, and this white reindeer, a mysterious white reindeer, comes and lures him to go and follow her beyond the horizon. So he forsakes family and everything and follows her. And finally, she lets him come near and turns into a beautiful woman and seduces him. And then she turns into a vampire and kills him. I shouldn't keep doing that. And so immediately after this, my date and I were hit by an off-duty psychiatrist who'd had 7 martinis and went 100 miles an hour and hit us head on. So I was floating above my body in this hospital, and this reindeer kept coming to me and wanting me to follow him. And I'm like, I would really love to, but I'm afraid. And I didn't follow him, and I woke up. And so I did a lot of reindeer imagery, but this one was literally a very bad pun. It's a reindeer. There's a garden hose going up its left hind leg, and it's a fountain. Can you see? It's raining. It was about the idea of a container leaking, like a medieval pitcher with holes in it used to water seedlings was one of my inspirations. This is the kind of horse sculpture that I had kind of grown up with or thought about. I think this one's in DC. And this was during the Vietnam War in '73, and I wanted to make horses, but I didn't want to make war horses. The horse has been, and then these horses were not war horses. The Chinese, the Tang horses, were in particular very much spiritual guides to leave you to the next world, although the Han horses had soldiers on them. And so these are the pieces that I ended up making. I wanted to make mares because mostly stallions were ridden into battle, and they were against being war horses. And I didn't know, I went door to door and tried to campaign against the war, and I just wasn't very good at it. Couldn't talk my parents even out of supporting it for a long time. And we read the I Ching a lot, and it told me to be like the sun at midday. And I thought, the only way I could figure it out was that I had to do the only thing I was any good at, and that I had to do it and shine. And it was how I gave myself permission to go into the studio. I mean, when your friends are being drafted and stuff, it was, I don't know, hard to give yourself that permission. So these pieces really embodied that for me. And this last one was a portrait of my mare Burlap that I got at the racehorse barn. And when I made her, a contractor, I had leased her to them to have a baby when I went to England. And he let me build an armature right at their place. He lent me a welder. And so around the wall from her paddock, I was welding, and then I would go out there, and I couldn't deal with a tape measure, so I measured her, like her point of her butt to the point of her chest was this long, and her head was this long, and hoof to fetlock this long, you know, everything, her hind leg was this long, and so we were like the same size. So like Da Vinci's Vitruvian Man, I felt that this was indeed a portrait on so many levels, both sort of spiritually and in this case very physically with this mare. And they were plaster and weighed about 700 pounds. And I got to have this show after graduate school at the Berkeley Art Museum. And it was on a bit of carpet with padding. And so the horses would, you know, they were a little bit tippy. And it was a teaching museum, so all the children would come in and they would swarm the horses, and the guards had to change every 4 hours because it was so stressful. I wanted them to be like Turner. Even though they were heavy and clunky, I wanted to paint them as if they were pieces of sky or an atmosphere. I was very influenced by Magritte, you know, particularly the reindeer. But this was more like Doubting Thomas. Could you put your hands inside? You know, were they really there, or were they just part of your own thoughts? Then in 76, or 74, I got a teaching job in Madison, Wisconsin, and was offered a show at the Madison Art Center, and had really gotten worn out with plaster pieces and concrete pieces. I had to bribe all these big guys and give them beer and things to make them, to help me. And so this was paper covered with mud, and it was very light. And it was so rewarding for me because I could put them upside down in my own studio and move them around to look at them in groupings. So the show had been in a print gallery, and the walls lit. So I just left the lighting that way. I didn't light them as objects. I wanted them to seem almost like dancers that were in a room. And they did have ears, and they did have kind of nostrils, but nothing else. But when you walked into the room, it felt like you were coming in late to a lecture. And you had to sidle between them, and there was a very dynamic tension in the room. And it was mud mixed with dextrin and pine needles, rabbit shit, you know, anything. And I smeared it on the horses because I had visited Secretariat in 76. And when I went to see him, he had the most valuable horse in the world, and he was completely covered in mud. And I thought it was so fabulous that he got to have a real horse life. But it also reminded me of New Guinea mud men and the figures that they made for the graves. And so there was, and that I loved clay the best before it was fired. And then I took a leave of absence from Madison. John got a job at Montana State University, and we lived up in the woods in the Lodgepole forest. And so I had gotten a review in Art Forum for these pieces, talked with a woman for hours, finally get a review, and she said to me, or the first sentence was, Deborah Butterfield's horses have no genitals. They didn't have eyes or hooves either. And so, you know, here I wanted to send it to my parents, and I'm like, oh, God. And then the plaster horses, the curator said to me, how is your work different than Nancy Graves? And I said, you know, I've seen a picture this big in black and white in Art Forum of her camels, and they are large mammals, domesticated mammals in a human space, but I think the difference is the point of view. That Nancy Graves was studying them from a very objective and scientific way. And for me, I was the horse, so the perspective was from the inside out versus the outside in. She says, "Oh, I was so hoping you would say that," and gave me a show. So anyway, this piece, I thought, well, the work was very successful. Was it only because it was big? You know, people were able to relate to it on a one-to-one scale as a large horse. And so I made this piece that was, you know, more Tang Dynasty horse size. But when I did that, the mud that had all the leaves and things in it took on a larger scale. And so then I got really carried away and started putting sticks through the armature and adding them on. And it ended up looking a bit like the Lodgepole forest. And also, I was thinking of Duchamp's The Nude Descending the Staircase, and the idea of implying motion by repeating the form. Oh, I can't find my, well, they're out of order. But I don't know, this ended up being one of my favorite pieces. And it was sort of the way a horse sees. One time I was riding my mare in California, and we both almost fell down. We saw a wild boar coming out of the ditch, and she was like this, and I felt her heart pounding, and I almost fell off. I spooked so bad. And then we looked at it, and it was a hollow log with snags. And, you know, she just kind of very ashamedly kind of oodled back home, and we were both just mortified, but we both saw it at the same time. And then this was my first show at Zola Lieberman Gallery, and William Lieberman is here tonight, and he helped this museum get my piece Redstick. His mother started the gallery in Chicago in the 70s, so this show was 77, yes, fall of 77. And the pieces were, again, they were self-portraits. They were mares, and so I thought of a mare lying down, or a woman lying down naked in an art gallery with the wolf critic predators stalking around. And the idea of laying down in front of them was, I felt, a very powerful position to take as a woman artist. So it was like, I'm burying myself before you because I'm strong. Horses can sleep standing up. They're a prey animal, and so they're built to lock their hind knees, and if they have to wake up and run at a moment's notice, they can. So when they lie down, they usually have one horse standing up, but it also means that they feel safe. And so these pieces were very much about that. And I also wanted them to look like there was no human hand involved, that perhaps these were just big clots of mud that I had gathered from the rivers. I'd been very emotional. I left being the head of sculpture in Madison to being a housewife for, you know, a while in Montana. And it was sort of a shock to my system. But as the spring rains, the floods receded, these things appeared on the riverbanks, and kind of my mind cleared, and I got really happy there. And then John and I ended up splitting the position eventually, and we used to fight over who got to teach, and then we fought over who had to teach. Anyway, these pieces they went to such wonderful places. I think the one on the left is at the Whitney, and I don't know, they all went to museums, the Oakland Museum, various ones. This was done in for 79, and it was about my father's death. And I had a show back east at the museum in New York. Oh, I can't even remember. and they couldn't afford to send me. They said, we can ship your art, but not you. So I made this work and sent them a compass and said, put their noses 3 feet apart. And these were, I had an experience in Madison where I did a sculpture of a Circus World horse at the museum in Baraboo, and they used them to pull these ancient circus wagons. But so I would go out in a herd of 8 big percherons, and they were so sweet, and they would come up to you, and you could do the kind of psychological game where you pretend, you just fall over, and they would pick you up with their foreheads and put you back in place, and you'd fall, and they would prop you back up. So, and then at the same time, I'd seen a book about Navajo sand paintings, and it showed a little girl being healed in the middle of this sand painting that had the 4 directions of the universe in it. And this power was coming to her. So this was sort of my metaphor to my dad. And I had to make it in the middle of winter, one of our coldest winters, and I had to go take my horse down into the woods and cut the wood off the trees and drag it out through the snow. And then I had to pickaxe the dirt out of the ground. So I couldn't just call the art supply store and order mud and sticks. And I don't know, because it was about my dad, even though I complained a lot, it felt very appropriate and helpful. And then this work followed in '79 at Hanson Fuller Gallery in San Francisco. And it was on the 6th floor. That was pretty exciting, getting it in with a crane. But in these pieces, I'm referring to rays of light, but also the hand. The sticks didn't just get there, they were placed by a human. So I was really referencing shelter and architecture, wiki-ups, campfires, these things. And then trying to also delineate the space of energy around the figure. And this piece, the very early piece I made, like the nude descending the stair, was very much like the Magritte painting. And this is when I started using the material. We bought an old farm, and I made all these trips to the dump and was buying rebar to make armatures and realized you're throwing away all this metal. You should be using that for your armatures. So I started welding the armatures using the old fence posts and realized they were so much more interesting. And I wanted to find a way of leaving the inside of the horses open so that I was no longer just dealing with this figure that was solid, excuse me, but trying to reveal, like an X-ray, what was inside of it, what was it thinking. And so this piece I threw a little bit of mud on and realized it was like a cake that I didn't need frosting on. And the work became more really about drawing at this point. And this is a good example of kind of how I think. Hog wire, I think you know, it's that square welded wire, and when you roll it up, it has this tensile streak and can explode and likes to go for your eyes and cut your arms. And so the wise thing to do when you're working with it is to put a stick through it to keep it from unraveling. And so this horse is all hog wire that's been crammed into this armature and jammed with sticks to keep it from leaving the figure. But at some point, the sticks are going to disintegrate and the wire will explode again. And it was kind of a metaphor for a lot of things, but they also say that a horse can return to the wild in about 3 weeks. And I think a lot of my friends were becoming pregnant at this point, and so I was really thinking more about inner workings. This is a piece. And then I got a Guggenheim to go to Israel and build a show at the Israel Museum in 1980. And we were there for a month, and I had an assistant from a kibbutz, and we had to bribe the guy at that museum to use their welder So I was welding out in this Billy Rose sculpture garden, and we went to all the dumps and things and got all this material, a lot of which had been through the various wars. And so it was just and we stayed in the government guest house, and it rained the day we got there, and it rained the day we left. And in between, it was perfect. I worked outside, and I don't know, we had such an amazing connection to the place. It was very powerful. But there were so many tourists around, and this piece, the first piece I made, was very abstract, and nobody knew what it was, and it was very frustrating. And then this one is made out of Arab ladders. They were building a new building next door, and all the construction workers were Arab, and they would bring me Turkish coffee every day and pieces of rebar and wood. And the ladders were so cool. They were wider at the bottom and then got narrow, so it kind of looked like they were longer than they were, but they were very stable. So this is called Jacob's Ladder, and it stayed in Israel. And this is Avi and I working in the sculpture garden. And every time the museum would call, there would be somebody praying on that sculpture base. And then there were warplanes zipping around. It was just an extraordinary experience. And this is a very fine mesh that I found at a junkyard. And then some impossibly thin, rusted sheet metal. And so I sewed the wire mesh on the piece and then sewed the sheet metal on, with wire, and then put another layer of mesh to sandwich it in so that it would stay there. And it was really my map of the world about how perilously fragile it is. And this is my only war horse. This is at Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago. And they had all these blown up troop carriers and tanks by the side of the road that they carefully preserved as war memorials. And so this was my war memorial. I think these were my first reclining horses. And then this piece was a little later. I had a show that traveled to many museums, but this incarnation was at the Walker Arts Center in Minneapolis, and they own this piece. It's called Rosary. It's from the crushed heating duct of Rosary Elementary School, a Catholic school in Bozeman. And it incorporates the crushed 2x4s and the pink brick dust from the whole thing. So I sprayed it with fixative to keep the pink brick dust on there. And then in '86, Thurston and Lila Twigsmith invited us to come to Hawaii, and I built a show for the Honolulu Advertiser Gallery, which later became the Contemporary Museum in Honolulu, and which has now merged with the Honolulu Academy of Arts, and now it's the Honolulu Museum. But anyway, he put us up for 3 months in his home in Holualoa, right above Kona on the Big Island. And so I had 3 months and an assistant and a little buzz box to get this piece. I made 5 pieces. But the roofs over there are all made out of colored sheet metal, and the weather is bad and there are hurricanes, and so I was able to go and scavenge this material from the various dumps. And this is called Maluhia. And this one, my mare had just had a baby, and I had had a baby not that long ago, and I was quite impressed with her poise and calmness, but she always had it like at 12:10 at night, and I was like a few minutes late, and she was already in labor and looking at me, like looking at her watch. Where have you been? But this is her, and it's called Red Thigh, or Uha Ula Ula. And that night, the Kilauea, the Pu'u'o'o volcano was erupting 1,600 feet into the air, fountaining. And there was a full moon, and at that time, the volcano was erupting every 28 days. And they try to tell you that there is no such thing as a goddess, you know? It's like... Anyway, I was able to go out and get a picture of this horse under the full moon with a volcano in the back. You know, it was just a crummy camera and a slide, but it was like I photographed my most amazing spiritual experience in my life. And John said, I'll give you my life's work for some land. And he said, well, I have to ask my daughters if they want this piece, and if she doesn't, I'll trade you art for the land. And as we drove home from this, I said, John, we're going to get the land. And the next morning he called and said, we'll do it. So that's how we got land in Kona and built a house there the next year. This was for my first show at Ed Thorpe Gallery in '86. And really my first real big steel pieces that I made in Montana. It took me years to collect enough metal to do these pieces. This is in a museum in Ohio. And this was my studio. That's Ferdinand, that's at the Yellowstone Art Museum, and another piece that lives in Florida. But it sort of shows how they grow out of the ground. The stuff just sort of climbs up, and the elves weld it at night. This was Riot. This is in Delaware. John and I had quit teaching, and one of our graduate students had returned and was teaching and had to have emergency surgery. And I had this show for New York at Ed Thorpe. I was panicking, but she asked if we would take her classes for her, and we said, okay. So I only had to teach morning and John afternoon. But still, I was really anxious about it. And in the backyard of the sculpture building were these beautiful letters. And the guy had moved to Canada and didn't want them, and so I bought them from him. And so by doing somebody a favor, I found this material that made my show just sing. And of course, she was so strong, she came back weeks early. And this is Palma. This is one I was able to keep. At this point, I was trying to see how minimal I could make them and still have them feel like horses. This one was very Picasso. The mouth or the front of the face is open like the horse in Guernica, screaming. But it was very much a mare, and so I thought of Paloma being his daughter. But John's mother's name is Palma, so I shortened it to Palma. This is Ikuzuki. It's from an old 1930s car, or dump with old 30s cars. And it reminded me of samurai armor. And so the story of Ikuzuki, he was a samurai horse who was abandoned as a child and looked into the reflection in the pond all the time to keep himself company. And so in this famous samurai battle, they had to cross this river in order to defeat their enemies. And the horses were afraid, but Ikuzuki was not, and so was the key to them winning the battle. And then this is the first piece for the Walker Art Center for their sculpture garden, and the first piece I made out of bronze, a big piece. And Mark Anderson, who owns the foundry, said, you know, drive out a truckload of sticks, we'll cast them in bronze, and then you can weld a piece out of it. And it was the most fun I ever had. And then the thing is the wood that's the most interesting is often the most fragile. It's rotten, it's got cracks, and it's not structurally sound, but it only needs to last long enough for them to invest it in plaster and burn it out. And then this shows how I used to work in Hawaii making big horses when I could afford to ship them home. Transportation for a container is tripled. We would ship bronze sticks to Hawaii, and Mark or someone from the foundry would come and we would TIG weld them together, and then I would tie real sticks, and in this case passion fruit vines, on them, ship them home, and they would take them apart, invest them, burn them out, weld them back together, and then I would come and do the patinas. So this piece is at the Kansas City Zoo, and this is it in bronze. And this is a piece that's at the Denver Art Museum named Lucky. They wanted 3 horses, and they wanted one that kids could climb on. And Klaus Grunke is this collector who was Ed Kienholz's main patron. And his daughter, Daniela, is a dressage rider in Germany. And she had given me her young rider, Prix St. George horse. And he came over, and he was a horse. I finally figured out that if you sat with him in a stall while he laid down and fed him carrots, you would win the show. If you did not do that, it didn't go very well. And so I thought he was the perfect one to have kids on him. And this is really a portrait of him. And this is Argus, because the birch has the eyes all over it, like Argus the cowherd in the Greek myth. And this is a piece I was talking about earlier with about conservation and wax buildup. And this is Second Daughter. Both of these horses were after my mare PJ, whom I bred and trained. And this is Walla Walla. There was this tree in the center of the foundry in Walla Walla, which is still there, but this ivy vine grows up it. And I was like the witch in Hansel and Gretel. And every time I would walk by, I'd kind of pinch it and want it, to die. And finally, Mark just said, just take it. We'll just cut it down. And the right hind leg is a bougainvillea vine from Bob Arneson's porch, which I had succeeded in wishing dead, and they brought up to me. So the foundation of that horse is Bob Arneson. I have bad thoughts towards trees sometimes. And this is made for a client who had property in California, and I got to make it out of this manzanita. And it's very much related to Redstick. Redstick is madrone. And it was so exciting for me because I'd never got to use the color or have that particular line quality. I feel that horses are so much, well, in this instance, the materials so much belie the inner parts of the horse. And I think of different materials as the same as different horses, like copper is so beautiful and it bends so easily, but at a certain point, it just will break. And steel is harder to bend, but you can bend it forever, and it will let you cut it with a torch. And bronze is very difficult. It's lighter, and it's somewhat easy to weld, but it just fractures, the cast bronze does. And then lead is so deliciously soft like butter, but then it has no structure. And so it's like dealing with different personalities or outlooks with people too. I really love how different materials, they resonate. And this shows part of my palette. This is the green and blue with a little yellow. And this is my steel studio. There's tractors in here too at times, but anyway, I use that hoist to put them together. And this is a better view of the palette. And so this shows a yellow horse that is coming together. And there he is. I made a trade with Dick Bear from Rockford, Illinois, who I gave him he bought a small bronze, said, you've got to come to Rockford. I have the biggest junkyard in the Midwest. And so I went, and he sent me home with 200 tons of steel delivered to my door. And, I could do anything I want. I go there, and there's this giant shear that can pick up a 20-foot propane tank by the corner like a carrot stick. And I could just tell it to do whatever I wanted. And then I went into the non-ferric metal, and there was lead and copper and all of these things. And he had the guys who worked at the yard come. I had a little show at Rockford College right before the show went to Zola Lieberman. And so the guys came and they saw my work, And then when I went and played with them in the junkyard, it was so wonderful. They felt really respected, and so they made piles for me. And one year I got a huge crate of crushed red metal for Christmas. Anyway, this piece is now at the Rockford Museum in name of Dick Bear, Yellow Bear, it's called. And this piece I named Rockford because I got all of this stuff there. It's this huge rebar, and then I love the way these concrete clods are stuck around the rebar when they rip up, something. And they reminded me of molecules, kind of like a model of different molecules. And this was a piece I made. It's a little out of time-wise, but I made this on September 12th, 2001. I just didn't know what to do with myself. It's called White Crane. And this is Boogie Woogie. I was asked on a panel once, what art would I own if I could own anything in the world? And I decided it had to be a Mondrian. This is called Turning Its Head. And this is one which I felt was so much like either a structure, a shelter, or how the wood, when it falls, gets stuck in the trees. And this is one I kept named Hawaii because it feels like an island. I took life drawing with Wayne Thiebaud, and I wasn't that good at drawing, but he really taught you how to look at things. And you had to go in, and you'd have the model, and he'd say, you have 10 minutes to draw up in this corner the model. So all drew naked ladies laying down up in the corner. Then he made us make a grid and hold our pencils up and plot where we saw these things. And then he finally let us connect the dots. And a reclining nude looks more like a mountain range, actually. And so this is where this piece came from. And this is Monekana, that's at the Smithsonian. And this is Hawaiian wood that I brought home. And this is one William had. It's called Fish Trap. These are bronze pieces that weigh about a ton, but it's alluding back to the early mud and stick pieces. When I collect the work, it's like here, the context of the wood that's on the trees, the fallen wood, it's just this composition that's so beautiful that I felt I had to start including it in the environment around the pieces. And this was from a fire that we had to evacuate our house from. And then this is another, this was at LA Louvre in Los Angeles. This was really the first one. I walked by it. It was all done. It was waxed. They wanted it early. And I leaned another stick up on it. And I went, oh my God, that's what it needs. So I had to call the gallery and tell them they couldn't have it for another couple months. And they were really upset with me, but it was really, it had to be. So these are some of my horses and the work that I've made from them. On the left is Victoria, and the right, Isabel. I rode these mares to Grand Prix. They were very special. They spoke German and Danish and English. And this is Isabel. She was, for a long time, well, she was in the traveling show, but she was in the embassy in Beijing. Max Baucus was our senator and then the ambassador to China. And he wanted it there in the residence for the Year of the Horse. It was wonderful. This was Hoover, and that's Hoover. He's in the Margulies collection. This was Rex. He was a saddlebred and very good at dressage and was the therapeutic horse of the year for the Northwest and second in the nation. He specialized in quadriplegics. We had the program at my barn, and his specialty was in the cart. We could drive a wheelchair into this cart. And I would sit in a little jump seat with the reins, and then we could Velcro the reins around the hands of the person in the chair. We were on CBS Sunday Morning with Ernie Pepione, an artist from Montana. And this is Rex. This was Ismani. And that's Ismani. Welded. This is all welded steel. This was Wilfred, Willie. This is him. This is Captain. He's a ranch horse. He was my only cow horse. And this is Captain. And this is Danuta, giant warm blood. And that's her. And this is Danuta. She's at the Speed Museum with another piece in Louisville. And this is Spotty, who's my current horse, almost at Grand Prix in dressage. He's half Appaloosa and half warm blood. And this is Spotty using these galls on the cottonwood to be the spots. And this is my other new mare, Dancia. And this is Redstick. I made some small pieces out of Redstick dogwood, and that's kind of where the name came from. And it's hard for you to make pieces that are this simple now, and I wish I could. I was really thrilled to see it. It's wonderful to have it here. And this is I made about 4 giant pieces. This is my son, Hunter. He was 5'9", and this piece weighs 4,000 pounds, and I don't know, it's about 9 feet tall. This was at Zola Lieberman. He had this huge space, and it had this giant column in the middle of it. And I fought with that column. I must have had 5 or 6 shows there, 3 pieces, 4 pieces, 5 pieces. And I knew this wouldn't look good with a normal-sized large horse. Like this would make Redstick look like a pony. And Bill said, let's just do the one in there. And so it was so generous of him to do this, but that column became a sapling. I dominated the column. I used to think it was about 6 feet across, but no. But it was so wonderful because there was this huge space like the end of this room, and you could go in there and you were just with this giant being. And my horses are all very much about a relationship with people, this dialogue. And this piece, even I was like, it became like the forest. Like, I felt like I wasn't quite as safe. I had to be more on my best manners. I don't know, it was a little scary. That's at the Des Moines Art Museum, their sculpture guard. This is my part of my studio in Walla Walla. It's an old greenhouse that's been repurposed. Nobody else could use it. The sidewalls are really low. It's like 120 in the summer. But it's perfect because my wood was outside and you'd have to spray it for weeds and it would get wet and fragile. So I have kind of the Walmart of sticks. And then sometimes I make the small pieces in there. I love being in there. The deer go in there and hide in the winter and from the hunters. And now apparently there's a fox living in my tsunami debris. This shows how the foundry puts the wood into an investment. This is a ceramic shell. So this is like a little horse. You can see its butt is on the top and its legs to the left and then the back on the right. And that they dip it over and over in the ceramic shell slurry. And then eventually they put it in a kiln and burn out the wood, and then burn out the ash, and then they fill it with bronze. Then they break the mold off, so it's a one of a kind. And this shows Mark Anderson with the induction furnace. So the bronze is about 2,300 degrees. And this shows him pouring it into the mold. After they take that ceramic shell, for my work, they will then put it into a traditional plaster mold and get it hot and pour the bronze in, because the ceramic shell is good to keep the delicate textures, but it's fragile. So then they double they put this other mold around it to keep the sides from blowing out. And this is a box of parts for Big Piney. So it shows the bronze. You can see how golden and bronzy it is, and there's heat patinas where it's been welded together. And this is showing them building one of these giant horses in the metal shop in Walla Walla. You can see they're welding it. They're welding it back together, and then they'll tool it so you cannot even tell what it looks like. And they'll sandblast it and bring it to my studio, and I go back. I can even change the bronze, but then I'll do the patinas. So here, this was a piece for New York that when I got there, I said, the neck is too long. So we cut the head off. Do you see the head is hanging on that crane to the right? And so we cut it off, and I had to move it back, and we had to adjust some sticks and re-weld it. But this is my studio there. The greenhouse is in the back, and a guy is working on a patina back there. And well, that's hard to see, but the head weighs a couple hundred pounds. And there it's going. And then it's back on, and this is me doing the patina. I have to get it about 350 degrees, and I put different white paint, black paint, and an acid ferric nitrate to make the rust colors. And I have to get it hot, and then all the colors act differently with different heat. Whether you put it on wet and then heat it, or you get it hot and then put it on. It's the hardest part I've ever done. Making things is easy, but the color is so difficult. So this shows this piece. I had a show in New York and Chelsea, and it shows what they had to do to get it up to the 6th floor. And through the skylight. And they weigh a ton, so. But I loved it. These are the guys who moved the Richard Serra's. And it's on the ground, but the guy he's treating it like it's really a horse. I loved that. And this shows the reclining one coming in. It's like the Ascension. And this shows you how big those really big ones are. These are at the Children's Hospital in Iowa City, thank you. And this shows it being placed. A lot of cranes, yeah, there's the guy from Chicago who helped me set them. So you can see how the piers are. They're dug into the ground, and then the horse is floating on it, and the landscape will come up just barely to the feet. Okay, so this is Hawaii. This is our view from our house on the Big Island, and this is Hualalai, which hasn't erupted yet. It's been 200 years. But this is the Ohia Forest, and we're at 3,400 feet. And we were drawn to the property because of all the dead trees. And these are feral horses and feral donkeys that kind of came with the property. And these show these ohia trees and how they kind of walk around at night when you're not looking, but how inspired I am by their movement. And to live with trees like this around you, I was really a horse lover, and I've become a tree hugger, I think. And these are giant hapu tree ferns, ancient tree ferns. This is what Hawaii used to look like. And another ohia. This is what I make a lot of all the Hawaiian wood that I use is ohia. And this shows my studio in Hawaii. And this is generally what the studio looks like. And my table always has all these sticks on it. And so the pieces with the wood on the ground, I think, very much reflect kind of how I live with them when I'm with them before they leave me. And this shows I have my models and directors, very handy. And this is my husband, John. We're in the Ohia and Koa forest. Our neighbors are ranchers. They have a 6,000-acre ranch and let me come and get wood. This is a koa tree. They kind of lay down and roll around. They're just the most amazing trees. And this is a root ball, like the one I saw today, and very much what inspired the early mud and stick pieces. And these are small bronzes that are from the Ohia using the leaves and seed flowers, but it's in bronze. This was at Zola Lieberman, and this was at Greg Kucera, and I'll be having a show there in June in Seattle. And this is a piece I made a while back in Hawaii called Kamehameha. It has a Hawaiian ancient canoe hull. Twigsmith gave it to me. It was riddled with termites and almost dust, but now it's in bronze. And so this is all wood collected at the ocean across from the birthplace of King Kamehameha. And this is another Ohia small piece. And this is the sunset from our house. It's more like Africa, I think, than what people think of Hawaii. And then this is Iceland. I've been invited, my son made connections through school and started going to Iceland in a painting class, and then 2 years now, every other year I go there, and my whole family does, and we stay for a month on this horse farm with another sculptor, and she lets us use her studio, and I make work. And this last year, we built a big show. We were in a group show about the environment at an alternative art space. But this is right near where we lived. Oh, this is the ocean by the Snæfellsnes volcano glacier. And I went and picked up a lot of, I was going to use sticks, but there's not much wood in Iceland, and most of it you find came from Norway or Russia in the ocean. And this is one of the horses that our friends had, the greatest horse. Oh my gosh. They're so brave. I always made fun of them, but they are so fierce and wonderful. And we went to their friend's place. This is an eider duck farm, and their birds are wild, but they make it safe. They block it off from foxes and dogs. So the birds come, and right before their eggs hatch, the ducks tear the eider down off their chest. The farmers come in and pull the eider down out of the nest and replace it with hay. And then the chicks hatch, and they just leave. They don't stay in the nest. So it's a reciprocal agreement. And this is Emma, my Hunter, my son's girlfriend, helping me scavenge. The winter tides bring all of this debris up, and then it slides on the ice, and it gets so far away from the ocean, you can't believe that it came there. And this is an Icelandic sheepdog, and behind him are some old eider duck boxes that were trashed and old, and so I took them and made this little horse out of it. This was in a show. We did a show with the Iceland people at Paula Anglum Gallery in San Francisco. This was my studio assistant in Iceland. So I had to use a lot of plastic and really thinking about what throws away. The fishing industry is a big problem, but there was just everything on the beach. And this is the sunset in Iceland. This is at 1 a.m. It does that for about an hour, and then it starts all over again. And that's my suitcase home. And this is a small piece I made from the suitcase and some boxes that I sent. And these were in the San Francisco show. And it's Zola Lieberman. And then this is Wyoming. I go down from Montana to this reservoir near Cody and collect all this wood. And when I first saw this wood, I thought I was going to have a heart attack. I'm like in Sanford and Sons, you know, it's going to be the big one. But that you can see my inspiration from here. This piece is made from that. And then this is, I found out about this tsunami debris that had been collected by a volunteer group of sportsmen in the islands in Alaska, and they sent it down to Seattle. It was supposed to be recycled. And there was something with the permits in the county, and they wouldn't let them do it, and they had it all under wraps. And the guy at Waste Management snuck me in, let me get into this dumpster, and I loaded it into this U-Haul. And this was a little tree growing on that buoy. It was like, oh, talk about hope. And so I made this piece about the tsunami, and this is all bronze, but this is the armature, and it shows what all my armatures are like. So every horse starts with this bronze armature, and then I tie real sticks onto it. And then they map it, take it apart, cast them in bronze, and then weld them back on. And that's at the point where I can still change things. But this piece, I used all of this debris and tied the real stuff onto the horse, so there's only enough bronze to make it structurally sound. And I don't know, I felt so moved by it, the pathos of it. And there were baby shoes, you know, toothbrushes, things like that. And so for the piece, I used a few soles of shoes and half helmets, but I tried to keep it more abstract so it wasn't so figurative, because it was just somehow, it looked like in Seattle, it just had washed in from the ocean. And here it was installed. And then it was in my show at LA Louvre last fall. And this is Hisaiba, which means a horse with no place to go out of this tsunami stuff. And then this is Montana. This is about 5 miles from my house, where this fire burned for about a month, maybe 5 years ago now. We had to evacuate all of our art and be ready to go. But anyway, this is one of the pieces I made from it. Big and piney. And this was a dangerous piece to patina. You know, it would not only burn you, but cut you when you reached in there to put the color on. But this shows the bark just coming off the tree, and how in a burned forest, you think it will all be blackened. But when it dries out, the bark falls off, and for a while, the wood looks so beautiful, as if it had been varnished. And then here you can see the little trees are coming back. And so this is a piece I made called the Millie Fire, and it just shows kind of how it starts happening. I painted the armature black so I could look at it all as one shape. And this shows another horse in progress, I make the body first. It's really like an abstract painting. And once I get that going, I weld the body first. Aha. Oops, I did it wrong. Oh no. Here, this thing. So I weld, no, come. This body shape on the floor. Whether it's big or little, I make that shape. Then I hang it from there, put the cross pieces by the shoulders and the butt, and then weld the legs down. And so I'm dealing with a rectangular canvas that's standing on 4 legs. It's sort of my easel. And so then I work with that, and by then I know who the horse is, and then I can figure out where the neck is. So we put a big neck piece on a hoist, and this is Brianne, an assistant there, and I'll stand back and she'll move the neck up and down, and then I go, yeah, that's him. You know, it's a matter of recognizing. And it's so amazing just when that thing moves like 6 inches, how the whole feeling of the piece, of who it is, changes. So I'm dealing with them in a brutal kind of abstract way, and then at the end, I personify them. I think it's harder if they're already personified to be very objective with the form. So this was the Millie fire, and this is before it was cast. And this was in New York last fall. But they were cast. And this is Danuta, my black mare. And that's it. All right.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think we'll take a question or two if anyone has a question for Deborah. Yes.
Yeah.
One moment.
Deborah, how long did it take you to make Redstick, the one we have here?
Well,
Any clue?
it's hard. You know, when I'm actually putting the piece together, only about 4 days, because I have all these people helping me. But it takes me months and years to collect the material. And then to put it together, it takes the foundry about 3 months, 20 different people who are specialists at what they do to make it. And then it takes me about at least 4 days to patina it. So it's pretty quick, if you would think of it that way, but I don't know. It seems, it's like I have that whole room full of sticks, but I never have the one that I need. Yeah.
Another question?
Okay.
Or?
All right. Oh, you can just yell.
Thank you. Do you have many other sculptures like Redstick that are out in the open, like ours is displayed?
That are what?
Displayed out in the open, outside.
Oh, yes. Yes, quite a few. We were just looking at it today. It has to be cleaned and re-waxed every year. You know, like if you buy a Ferrari, you don't just leave it sitting out and not do anything with it. And yeah, I usually wax them with a weed burner, a big torch. And you get it warm enough and you put the wax on that it will glide into it. It opens the pores of the bronze so the wax can really go in there. But it doesn't allow too much wax to stay on the surface. And I think what they've been doing here is cold waxing, which will really preserve the bronze, but it builds up and it ends up looking like metal. And I like it to be more matte. And so, but it's scary. People are afraid they're going to ruin the patina. And you wouldn't do it to a Henry Moore or Tom Otterness, you know. They need to be cold waxed. But when you have a texture like that and you're trying to impersonate wood, it's kind of what needs to happen. But anyway, so they take some routine maintenance. The bronze is alive and it keeps oxidizing. And it's always a problem fighting the green. One piece I made that was in Los Angeles, the people kept having it cleaned and waxed, and they finally got me down there. It had turned this beautiful red. And they said, we don't know what we're going to do. And I said, man, if I could have figured out that patina, I would have done it. If I, you know, it's fabulous. Just leave it. And so they did. And then one at the Portland Art Museum had grown this yellow mold moss on it. And it was sensational too, kind of a yellow-green. But my first work that I made some little horses that were made of such esoteric material, and the people who bought them, I think paid $600 for them. And 30 years later, some of them have disintegrated. And I thought, you know, it's cheaper than cable television, you know? So a lot of them were meant to just sort of go back into the earth. But then when you become more successful, then you kind of can't, people don't want you to get away with that. And so for me, it was the bronze, but I didn't want to have to become the art conservator because I'm too clumsy and impatient. And that's why I went to the bronze, not just so I could put them outside. I actually prefer them indoors in a human space. But, you know, the wire stretches, the wood shrinks, and you go somewhere and you have a small wood horse that's like this. And you know, so I would spend all my time redoing the pieces, but it will never be the same as when you made it. And you don't remember, there's no way you can. And so the bronze for me at least ensures that the form will be the same. Like the Greek sculptures were all painted originally, and we see them without arms and all white, and we would be horrified, I think, if we saw them painted anew, you know, but that's how it is. Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate it.